From Lewis in the Black Horse Pub. Well, here's one, and is this by message?
Yeah, I'm afraid
Yes.
it's
Two.
It's a 1B morning, I'm afraid.
A 1B morning. Haha.
Yeah, dear old Phil is engaged with personal matters, which is understandable. And so there we go. I just wanted to say that I've had the pleasure since we last spoke of having a bit of a funny turn. I got a fever. And if any of your viewers wish to hallucinate lawfully without the use of drugs, then I suggest they get themselves a temperature of 40 degrees centigrade, because you do go mad. And I'm very grateful for Mrs. B, because had she not been around, the paramedics who tended to me would have seen me hallucinating, and because of various medical interventions I've had recently, with a lot of pinpricks in my arm, and I think they would have assumed I was a heroin addict. Which I should, just for the record, say I'm not. That's not the case, but it's been. I'm very much better, I promise you. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you. But it was about 4 or 5 hours.
Did you call the paramedics, or did Mrs. B?
No, she had to call them, because I have little recollection of between about 1 a.m. Saturday morning through to about 7 a.m. Saturday morning, when they just pumped me full of antibiotics, and then the buggers wanted to keep me in hospital, which I declined, because I have little doubt that it was a previous medical intervention that I had on Wednesday, quite a significant one, that led to the infection anyway. So I had to sign a disclaimer saying, I go out of here. I'm not mad, and but they just wanted to keep me. And I thought, I don't want to sit in a room or lie in a room with 5 other people who are unwell.
And who are likely to give me other things.
Yeah, in a place where there are all these. I've had two in the last year or so. I've had two significant infections with the consequences. Of, the staff are lovely. They're very patient, but I'm not willing to stay over.
Yeah.
Anyway, how are you?
Not putting down the hospitals or staff and so on, but if you want to
Yeah,
catch something, a hospital is a place to go.
absolutely. Yeah, there are too many sick people there.
That's right. Yeah.
Are you well, Keith?
Yes, I'm fine after my little scare. I
Yeah,
still haven't a clue what's wrong with me, but since it hasn't happened again, we hope it's a temporary aberration.
good. And I see that you've managed to travel despite the weather. Was that bus you did today, or did you?
I did my scooter.
Oh, good
Um,
in this weather, blimey.
well, it wasn't that pleasant. The thing is, that it only started to rain very hard about a minute after I'd got onto the damn thing and set out.
Yeah. That's always the way, isn't it? Anyway, as Keith, we don't have the benefit of Phil's wisdom, and I use the term in a slightly ironic way there. Um, I thought we'd talk about something that may be of interest. And as you know, I never tell you the subject before we broadcast in a
Absolutely
bit.
not. It's my weekly surprise. Yes.
And because I think you're at your best when you're sort of caught out. I think you're light on your feet, fella. And I thought I'd talk about something which is of great interest to me. It always has been, in fact. And I think it would be of interest to you as a journalist as well. And something which if I may say at the start, I've been significantly helped in considering by my eldest daughter, who is a linguist. She speaks several languages, and it's the art of translation.
Uh-huh.
And I've no doubt that you've had to come across that yourself, Keith,
Yes, indeed.
because obviously in Canada, it's effectively a bilingual country in many respects. But then somewhere like Romania, you move into a completely different field.
Yes.
Probably Northern Ireland less so, but yeah. So I thought,
Northern Ireland is most definitely you need a translator.
yeah, but well, you see that's an interesting question that we might come on to as to, I because I'm a Scottish origin. People talk to me about Robbie Burns and whether he needs translating, and I say, no, you can't translate Robbie Burns.
Yeah.
You just need to learn. And he doesn't speak Scots Gaelic. He speaks Scots, which is it's a sort of sub form of English. Query whether it's a language or whether it's quite what category you put it in. But I think you lose a lot with those dialects if you try to sanitize them by putting. But I wanted to start, Keith, with something which is much closer to your heart than mine. Almost every Sunday, and that's the Bible.
Uh-huh.
Because of course, people assume the Bible, and there are people who literally take it as the word. There are, in other words, believers who take it literally. But that's difficult because, of course, it wasn't written in English because English wasn't around. And I was just wondering what your take on that is, Keith.
Well, I'm not quite sure on what plane we're talking about, but the first thing that springs to mind is in the movie A Miracle on 34th Street. Father Christmas, Santa Claus, says when he's giving evidence, of course, my land, Santa land, is on a different plane. I thought everybody understood that. And I've always thought that really the Bible is on a different plane. I thought everybody understood that. And of course, a lot of people don't. They take it as if it's a narrative of what actually happened. And so the transfer of being on another plane to, hey, this is a chronicle, is a very difficult one for a lot of people, including, I may say, me. I, I struggle with faith and religion a great deal. I've come to the conclusion that I'm much safer thinking that there is a God than there isn't a God. But don't ask me to prove it, and don't ask me to get into any great discussion that is to do with divinity, because I can't and won't do it. I don't have that sort of mind.
No, you remind me of the joke about the little girl who says, "Why does grandmother keep reading the Bible?" And her mother says, "Well, she's just prepping up for her final exams."
Well, I mean, is there some of that in it? I mean, as you know, I don't sort of hide much about myself, but I suppose that somewhere lurking there is I just want to make sure that if I get to the pearly gates and somebody says, "Come in," that he's sufficiently sympathetic to me to open the door. And so I hedge my bets. But I'm afraid, I suppose I would go down as sort of a near agnostic rather than an atheist, but certainly not a full believer.
No, I think the whole issue of belief is interesting, but I think for today's purposes, if you don't mind, we narrow the issue down to the fact that, I don't know if you remember the Mel Gibson film about the Passion, where it was all actually spoken in Aramaic.
No, I don't remember this.
Which was supposedly the language spoken at the time, and the language in which the Bible was originally written, and then it was translated into Greek and then Latin. And then, of course, you had the scholars, the monks of the 10th, 11th, 12th century poring over their text. You had King James creating his, or having his version of the Bible created with a early English translation. And nowadays you get Bibles that are in a whole range of types of English.
Yeah. Of course, Queen Mary burned people at the stake in Lewis for reading the Bible in English.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very contentious issue.
Yeah.
To allow the people to have what was perceived to be that knowledge. So translation is in fact not simply a sort of formulaic issue where, people, there are things like Google Translate. And when I mentioned that to my eldest daughter, she sort of, there were a range of profanities that came out of her mouth, because it ignores that there's a whole range of subtleties with translation. There's the attempts, and she described this to me, how in the United Nations, when they have debates, they have two translators. Of course, it's all recorded.
Morning.
But they have the simultaneous translation, which is a sort of an attempt to convey the meaning of the words into a different language. And that's a great skill to do that, to be listening and to be talking at the same time. And I don't know if you ever worked with anybody who does that, Keith, but
I've worked with a couple of people that, strangely enough, I had a translator in Bosnia who was Paddy Ashton's translator. It was quite
Oh, right.
interesting. One or two little stories there.
But deeply skillful people, though, they are.
Yes, they are extremely. But even they would admit that if I say so, is they don't know how to interpret it in case I would say so.
Yes.
In other words, is inflection. It can be so important in translation. And
Yes. And apparently at the United Nations, they have a second interpreter who takes a literal translation, word for word, of what is being said, even if it doesn't make sense. Because you will appreciate, Keith, that in different languages, word order changes, as you've just said, meanings change, inflections change, and those things can be easily lost. And there will always be a tension, no matter what's being translated. And I know this is from a lawyer's perspective, where there's a foreign treaty or a foreign document of some kind that needs to be translated into English. That there's a tension between a literal translation and, in fact, a translation that conveys the meaning. Because sometimes the latter requires the translator to move away from the immediate words of the text, in the same way that when you were writing articles in Bosnia, for example, there would be idioms that you use, there would be words that you use that perhaps wouldn't immediately translate.
yeah,
And it would be a question of balancing the literal words you were using. So, in other words, to be true to your words and to convey the meaning. And the art. That's why I say it's an art of translation. It's not.
yeah, yeah.
It's not formulaic. It's not something that just sort of falls out of a computer, which sadly Google Translate and Co. do nowadays. And it covers such a range of topics. So journalism is important because the things you say have power, and if they're misunderstood, mistranslated, that power can cause problems. Translation is important in my work because you might get a court order from a foreign country, and being able to understand it and interpret it properly is very difficult. And then in every field, so in science, for example, scientific papers need to be translated. That's tricky. And also in literature, and that's probably
That's the most difficult of the lot.
yeah, and that's probably where I got my interest in the topic.
Yeah. Just as a matter of interest, is there are two other things to be taken into consideration. I think is I was no more than 3 years ago, I suppose, training, which is a very loose word, a group of officials from Indonesia in, of all things, what is a constitutional monarchy. And we had a translator, and they complained that the translator didn't seem to be giving the correct interpretation. So we brought in a second translator, but didn't send the first one away. And they actually had stand-up rows about what the correct translation should be. In other words, neither of them accepted what the other was interpreting. So there's that sort of division as well. And then closer to home, in Canada they have a phrase or a saying, as you were just mentioning, and that it's the whole ball of wax. What it means is everything in its entirety. And I would say to the people in my newsroom, newly back from Canada, if you do that, we will lose the whole ball of wax. And they would look at me vacantly. They hadn't a clue what the hell I was talking about. People like to say so.
You see, this impinges on my professional life quite a lot, because inevitably there are defendants and there are witnesses for whom English isn't their first language, some of whom have no English, some of whom have very little English, and those who have very little English typically are permitted to have a translator interpreter with them, because it's a stressful situation, and lawyers, as you know, are paid by the word, and talk rubbish. And I have to say, the difference between a good translator and a bad one in court is so clear, so noticeable, that it can be shocking sometimes. I've got two stories on that, if that's okay, Keith.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a group of people who were taken off an island in the middle of the Pacific some years ago. There's an American air base there now. And they were flown into Gatwick, having been removed from their home. And they all went and lived in Crawley. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them have chosen a life that involves people like me, as opposed to a lawful life. But there's only one interpreter in the whole country who speaks the patois that they speak. And he's the best paid interpreter in the country. So he spends his life at Lewis Crown. He's a lovely fella, very gentle. But he spends his life at Lewis Crown Court, dealing with these people in a very patient way. And you think, yeah, you've got a job for life there, mate. That's brilliant. Well done, you. And he's now dealing with sort of second generation. So he's not just dealing with people who were flown out. He's dealing with their children. And the other story I have, and I promise you, I'm not going to say anything rude, is there was a trial going on in Lewis, literally Lewis Crown Court, where both the defendant required an interpreter and the prosecution witness, needed an interpreter in the same language. And it was a sort of East Asian language that they spoke. And prosecutor was cross-examining this witness for about half an hour, when the interpreter from the dock with the defendant said, as you say, he's not interpreting properly. And they have to take an oath, interpreters in court. I will well and truly interpret every word that's said, blah, blah, blah. And the judge said, well, why are you saying that this interpreter isn't translating properly? And he said, well, since we started, albeit he's answering the questions, he ends every answer with the words, you mother effer, full use. So this bloke was just taking advantage of the fact that he thought nobody would pick up on him just being rude. But coming back to the literature point, 'cause I think that's really where my interest started. I know that.
Just before we do that, could I say there's one other element which I'm sure you had to take into account in the past. I knew for a while, I don't sort of move in those circles anymore, but a forensic audio expert who could listen to an audio tape and actually interpret what people meant as opposed to what they said, which was a very interesting thing.
Yes, I've had a few cases like that. I had one where there was somebody on their phone, and they were attacked, unfortunately, and it wasn't clear at all what was being said on the phone. Both sides had exactly that, audio experts trying to interpret the words that were being used. The other one I had many years ago was it's not funny at all. It was up at St Nicholas's Church in Brighton, just north of Churchill Square, and it was a young couple, who were having Congress over the grave of Martha Gunn, which you may have heard of. She was the most famous dipper in Brighton in her day, and she's got a grave there with a railing around it. And there was a couple who lived across the way who were fed up of people, youngsters, cavorting in the churchyard. And so the bloke had set up a camera to take evidence of what was going on. I'm not quite sure that's the only reason he had it, I have to say, but anyway, that's a different point. because during the course of this incident, he had the audio on, and you could hear his wife saying, "Well, okay, you've filmed enough." He said, "Yeah, I've turned it off. Don't worry." He hadn't. He was still watching it. But it was a very interesting question, and we ended up having to have a lip interpreter, because you could see the woman involved, the young woman involved.
Yeah.
And it was a question of whether she was making an ooh of pleasure.
It's not that expensive, Wayne. It's just
of displeasure, and rejecting the advances that she had from behind her. And it was a fascinating, I know it's a horrible topic, but it was a fascinating little bit of expert evidence that people who lip read for a living, and again, it's one of those areas where I think there are good lip readers, and there are bad ones. You occasionally hear about, after a football match or something, or a rugby game where there's been a bit of verbals, they get the lip readers in to give their view of what it is that somebody has said. And some of it, I'm sure, is genuine, but some of it is I think, in the balance as to whether or not it's quite believable. But anyway, there we go.
Yeah, it's the other thing that I find difficult is when it's not instant translation. So you read a passage, and then the translator reads the passage.
Yeah.
And there was one occasion I was giving a speech in Bosnia, and I realized that they'd allowed a half hour for this speech. And I got a quarter of the way through in the half hour, and I had to sort of wing it and cut half the thing out and edit it in my mind, because otherwise we'd have been there all day.
Oh yeah, regularly in court, when you do the sort of preparation for a case and you have the preliminary hearing where you're sorting things out, it's pretty common to say, look, this is a 4-day case, but we have an interpreter, so it's an 8-day case for exactly that reason. And of course, interpreting in that way, translating in that way, I've no doubt is quite a tiring process, and they need their breaks. It's it's not easy. But anyway, coming back to literature, I remember hearing the story that Clive James, a great journalist in his own right, and a very learned man, apparently he decided that he wanted to read Tolstoy in the original. So he learned Russian. Now, I think that rather goes above and beyond the call. But it's admirable in its own right. But I do wonder, without the cultural background and immersing himself in that, whether he got more out of that as opposed to reading a translator's version, which wasn't exactly the same as the original, but would have captured much more of the essence of it, because translators, as we know, wrestle with those issues of how do I convey not just the literal words, but the meaning behind them, the cultural significance of what we're saying. And I find it difficult, and I have friends who simply won't read foreign literature in translation, and I find that deeply disappointing, because there's such a rich growth of literature in other languages which has been perfectly adequately translated. And I think of things like Jorge Borges, the Argentinian author, who I think may have done some of his own translations, because he was half Argentinian and half English. And he wrote beautiful, surreal short stories. I strongly recommend him to you. Borges, his surname. Just one of those wonderful writers. And he is the man who, when the Falkland, half Argentinian, half English, when the Falkland Wars occurred, he was the one who said, this is like two bald men fighting over a comb. And of course, Samuel Beckett, who wrote, for example, Waiting for Godot originally in French because he could, and then translated it himself into English. So there are people who can do that, the extremely clever ones. But there's so much great literature out there that, and I think in particular being English, we are rather sniffy about translations because we assume everything's going to be translated into English. And the truth is that that's probably what occurs, because if you're a Norwegian author and you want to publish your book in Portugal, you won't find anybody who's going to translate it from the Norwegian to the Portuguese. There simply won't be anybody available to do it. But what you will find is that if you get it translated into English, ironically, I suppose, what might be termed the lingua franca, even though it's English, it will then also be translated on into Portuguese. And very, very many works of literature get translated into English and then further on translated. And there's that difficult question then of how many, how much are you diluting the original with more translations of things to come?
Yeah. Well, I mean, going back to your original query of me and the Bible is how much importance, I suppose, does any individual put in the actual literacy of translation? I mean, I would have thought that one can write or read a great novel that's been translated, and you get the import of it, even though one or two things may have been altered by translation throughout. So, do you lose that much, or are they so important in having been mistranslated that they alter the whole import of the entire work? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, and I've thought about it before. You're forcing me to think, but.
Well, I'm glad Monday morning. You need.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I would always consider and it's difficult to know because if you don't know the original language, you don't know whether it's a good translation or not. But a good translation is which gives you access to a piece of literature or the Bible or whatever it might be, is a darn sight better than simply not having access to it at all.
Yeah.
But no question. One of the examples I always think of, which I think is an extraordinary piece of translation by a bloke called Gilbert Adair, who translated some of the works, not all of the works, of probably my favourite author, who I've never read in the French. I couldn't read in the French because it's too complex, called Georges Perec, P-E-R-E-C, who wrote a massive volume called Life a User's Manual, which is just an extraordinarily clever book. You don't need to know French to read the translation of that. But Perec was he was a sort of rather tricksy writer who enjoyed playing with words. He was part of what was called the Oulipo, which was a French group who combined mathematics and literature and various other disciplines. And sadly, he died early. But he, for example, wrote the longest ever palindrome. And you know what a palindrome is?
Yeah.
Same forwards and backwards. And it ran for hundreds of letters. Just an extraordinary piece of linguistic acrobatics on his part. And then he wrote a book in French where it's a proper story. There's no question about that. And he doesn't mention in it the fact that he doesn't, in French, use the letter E at all.
Wow.
And Gilbert Adair translated it into English, and it's called a void, in other words, a gap. And again, he doesn't mention the fact that it doesn't have any E's in it. But to take something like that and to which was itself a sort of a slightly conceited feat of literature on the part of Perec. But then to actually take that, keep its meaning, and keep that core principle that there are no e's in it, strikes me as it would potentially drive you mad. But he did it.
Yeah, we need to, I think.
Yeah, but if you you could buy a copy of it and it won't tell you that it doesn't have an E in it.
No ease. Oh,
Yeah.
thank you, Ada.
It's the most common letter in the French language and the most common letter in the English language.
And to do it, it's a feat in itself.
And he wrote it for various reasons. One of the reasons he wrote it is that he was a French Jew and he lost his family in the Holocaust, and so he's referring to a gap, a gap that people don't see. He walks down the street, he goes to the cafe. People don't know that he has this gaping gap in his life. So it isn't just a conceit on his part. It's actually saying something quite profound about his own life.
Yeah.
And what he had to put up with. I'd recommend Perec to anybody who wants to read that. And as I said, I've never read him in French. That's not quite true, actually. I have read some of the Oulipo, the group who wrote these things, and I've struggled through the French. But you don't need to read them in French. You get the meaning of it, and it's oddly profound without. So it's work that translates with some difficulty, but you still get the sense of the emotions behind it, which I think is that's great translation. If you can understand what's going on behind it all.
Can I just give you something of a lighter side that occurred, which just shows how you can actually focus on something and then totally ignore it. When I was in Kosovo, Kosovo is one of my favorite countries. The people are very bright. And I would, when I came back for leave, I would pick up books and take them back and give them to my staff to read. And I saw a book in Brighton that was just beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I totally forgot why I was buying books. And I bought this book and I took it back and I gave it to my media law advisor, who was a particularly bright young lady. And she came into my office and she said, "Thank you very much, Keith, but I don't think that this served the purpose. It was Raymond Briggs the Snowman, no dialogue."
Yes. I can sort of see that. In your professional life, for example, in Canada, I don't know to what extent the bilingual nature of the country meant that your work was in any way translated, or was that simply the Quebec area, and so it was of less concern where you were in Vancouver?
Well, it's interesting because the French influence in speech and culture gets less and less as you come across the country. And in fact, in British Columbia, there is only one French community, Maillardville. And if you go there, you can walk into a French-type pub, and there are old boys speaking French there with long clay pipes. As the whole French culture encapsulated in this tiny little town. So everything in French, everything in Canada has to be bilingual. But in speaking it, no. But I found this disadvantage. My French is schoolboy French. I can still speak a bit of it, but is I covered the very first constitutional conference that Pierre Trudeau, Justin's father, called in British Columbia. And it was held in the Parliament buildings. And every premier and every province was represented as they debated repatriating the Canadian Constitution from Westminster, where it had lain for, well, I don't know, since 17 something, 18 something. And everything was done in French. And because it was federal government, everything came first in French and second in English. And that was sort of, I mean, there were a few grumbles, of course, but also it made it very strange to have this language spoken first, and then English almost as a translation afterwards. And I really did feel very odd about that. But generally speaking, it is a big issue still, the French Canadian, English Canadian divide in Canada. And of course, language then therefore comes to the heart of it.
Yes. You know, I as I've probably told you and your one man and his dog before, I've been learning Scots Gaelic for a number of years. And in fact, in Cape Breton, on the east coast of Canada, there are communities that still speak Scots Gaelic. So there were settlers there, and it's interesting because it's one, it's the Tower of Babel issue, which is that a group splits off geographically, and they end up acquiring their own idioms and words, and so they completely understand each other. In other words, Scots and Canadians, but they definitely have some different words. Just moving on from that.
Well, just before we do, you might be interested to know that Quebec is a very, very big province. I mean, we tend to talk about the Canadian provinces, but they are huge. I mean, British Columbia is 3 times the size of the British Isles, for instance, and Quebec is even bigger than that. And a lot of these communities get cut off in the winter. So they actually do develop their own patois. And for instance, in many communities in French Canada, particularly in Quebec, they would say la carte, meaning the car, not l'auto. In other words, the language, the French language there has not developed the way that it has in France. And the difference is very, very obvious. And just as another little extra, the winters are so fierce that a lot of these communities, like your Cape Breton communities, are totally cut off in the winter. And they sort of, come October, they say goodbye to the outside world. And it's not until March that they actually say hello again. And that, in fact, a lot of things are shared, not just language, but quite often in some of these communities, they share the ladies. And they will cycle them around the families, as it were. And as a matter of rote, they don't see anything immoral or distasteful in it. And it's the way that they actually get through very, very harsh winters, cut off from mankind.
Sounds like Cliff High Street to me, but there we go. I recall this as a student, because I went to a small college. There were about not even 200 of us at the college. And we were relatively insular. I wasn't going to join Boris and David in the Bullingdon Club. Not that I was ever invited, I must say. But I was aware that we had our own patois within the college. We had our own words, our own phrases that outsiders just wouldn't understand, which had evolved because of events that occurred within the college, within the junior common room amongst the students. And you can quite see how you don't need to be too much of a cut-off community to create, if not a separate language, at least a sort of spin-off language, which differs from the main one. And I think, you can. I do wonder in the British Isles whether we're losing that because of the internet, because people are able to see each other day in, day out. And I think it would be a terrible shame. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to learn Scots Gaelic, because it's on one level potentially a dying language. Albeit, I'm hoping to get for Christmas, Keith, they've brought out a Scots Gaelic Scrabble.
Aha!
I will probably have to play alone, but I quite like the idea of that. But for a relative, as you say, we're a modest-sized group of islands, and we have within us 6 languages. We've got English. I don't think Scots itself is a language. It's a spin-off of English. In other words, what my grandparents spoke, which wouldn't be understandable, but that's because of the words used as opposed to the word order. It's not a completely separate language. There's Scots Gaelic, there's Welsh, there's Manx, there's Cornish, and there's Irish.
I don't think those are going to disappear. I mean, not to sound name dropping. I don't mean to, but one of your own eminent Lord Justices once said in a conversation with 3 or 4 people, is Keith, I can't tell where you're from the way that you speak, which indicated to me that they paid great attention to accents still, to try and identify where people are from. And I think that probably within the British Isles is that our dialects, if you want to call them dialects, from region to region, are still very strong and likely to remain so.
Yeah, I was at the hospital over the weekend, and there was a very nice nurse dealing with me, and I said, West Coast? And she said, yeah, Motherwell. I said, I thought so. Because, I can pick up a region with a Scots accent, really, because of my family. And I quite enjoy. As you may know, in this country, within the jurisdiction, which is England and Wales, Scotland, as you know, we've already discussed this, has a separate legal jurisdiction. But within England and Wales, you can request that your case is heard in Welsh. And there are designated judges, and there are several of them now, who are fluent Welsh speakers who will hear cases in Welsh. And I consider that to be a marvelous thing. I find Welsh very difficult. I've tried learning it. It's I can only really speak it when I have some catarrh or something, or phlegm in the back of my throat. But I keep trying because I'd like to be able to speak it. The one I really would like to learn and would like to sort of read in translation is Cornish. My mother's side of my family were Cornish, and that was a language that died out. And if you go to Paul, which is a village above Mousehole, right at the foot of Cornwall, there's a gravestone there for a woman from the late 18th century, which proclaims her the last native Cornish speaker. And it just died out as a language for 2 centuries. But they're making efforts down there to try to bring it back. I think it's going to be tough for them.
Yeah, although I think that stands more of a chance. And for instance, it's the extremists, as I would call them, those people, for instance, who would say that the whole of Ireland should speak Gaelic. I mean, it's that's a silly nonsense, because the country and people within have got to communicate outside, and by pushing it, you actually achieve the opposite aim than actually nourishing it. But using it sensibly, for instance, the Irish have road names in both languages in many parts of the country, and that is a sensible way of actually preserving a language, a minority language.
Yeah, and all the children over there are required to take Irish as a subject, and I've got nephews over there who, when they were younger, were packed off to an Irish school, which was a week where they go to a sort of camp. Lots of fun activities, but they could only speak Irish. And if you want to learn a language, you really need to immerse yourself in it like that.
Yes, you do. You do. I mean, actually, strangely enough, I can speak very little of it now. But when I went to Kosovo, I actually realized that they speak Albanian.
Right.
And my secretary was a qualified teacher. And she used to get up at some ungodly hour and come in from the provinces into my office. We would meet at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I would study it 2 hours a day. And although we obviously had to communicate in English to run the thing, but nonetheless, I would, whenever I went out for lunch and so on, I would try hard to just pretend that I wasn't trying to translate it into English. And I actually became reasonably fluent in Albanian for a while. It's because being immersed in it.
I do have to say, Keith, that I'm just having Albanian lessons with my secretary. Does sound like a euphemism for something else, but there we go.
Too early in the morning.
Yeah. Now, Keith, I need to go because I've got another hospital appointment.
Well, I'm delighted that we've gone 59 minutes exactly, and once again, fascinating chat. And Richard, we wish you every success at the hospital, that they actually managed to put you back on the right track.
They hopefully they won't kill me. Yeah, quite.
You are missed.
No, thank you. You're very kind. Well, I hope to see you on Friday. I've got a topic with Phil that we're probably going to need to do over a couple of days, because it's a big topic and it's one that we're both interested in. So we'll deal with that Friday, Monday. Okay.
Well, thank you. I mean, you challenged me again. Perhaps not quite as broader stories as I'm sometimes able to relate, but nonetheless, I think that we roamed over a whole host of things, and I always find these interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I'm away.
Look forward to seeing you on. See you on Monday. Okie dokie. Well, what the hell? Let's In the Black Horse Pub. Well, just before I say toodle pip for just a couple of minutes or so, to take what we always consider to be a natural break throughout the 3 hours that we're on air in the morning, let me just say two things. First of all, there is a beautiful window, a wonderful big window at the Black Horse. If you're wandering by and you look in on a Monday, a Wednesday, or a Friday, and you see us broadcasting here, wave. We're only too happy to dip into. We're not like the BBC. We don't get all snooty about interruptions. That's why we love Ada coming and leaning over our shoulder and bringing us coffee and chatting to us and other people as the morning unfolds. So don't hesitate to come and wave. In fact, if you want to come round to the side door, come and say hello. Although I'm not sure whether Declan would approve of that. The other thing is that I'm around town as normally I wear the blue hat. I just took delivery last week of a red hat and a yellow hat. And of course, I've got the famous Trilby, the brown hat. So any one of those, keep an eye open for them, particularly the blue one. And if you see the blue hat, and if you see me perched on a little scooter, say hello. A lot of you do, and a lot of you say how much they like the hat. And I'm very gratified because I wondered about it when I first put it on. But Mirador Television, and we are of and for Lewis. We're around about Lewis, so don't hesitate to say, hey, you. And look us in the eye, even if you don't particularly care for us. But there we are. That's just a small note about me and about Mirador and the Black Horse. We'll be back in, say, 5 to 10 minutes. Till then, toodle pip.